Whistleblower associated with WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, appeared to be making a statement as he was shuffled out in handcuffs from the Ecuadorian embassy in London. He was carrying a book published by the Real News Network with Gore Vidal on the history of the national security state. We gather Assange may have been trying to send the world a message, as did the Washington Post. And you can find an interview that Paul Jay, the senior editor here at the Real News Network, had done with the Washington Post in the link below. On to talk about Assange and the reasons for his arrest is a man that is perhaps the most famous whistleblower in history that has experienced this type of arrest and state threats is Daniel Ellsberg, who leaked the famous Pentagon Papers. Daniel's new book, The Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner. You will find an interview series related to Daniel's book here on the... Daniel, your reaction to what has just happened to Julian Assange in London?
It's a very serious assault on the First Amendment. Clear attempt to rescind the freedom of the press, essentially. Up till now, we've had a dozen or so indictments of sources, of which my prosecution was the very first prosecution of an American for disclosing information to the American public. And that was ended a couple of years later by governmental misconduct. There were two others before President Obama and 9 or so under President Obama of sources, none of these having been tested in the Supreme Court yet as to their relation to the First Amendment, hasn't gone to them. This is the first indictment of a journalist, an editor or publisher, Julian Assange, and if it's successful, it will not be the last. This clearly is a part of President Trump's war on the press, what he calls the enemy of the state. And if he succeeds in putting Julian Assange in prison, where I think he'll be for life if he goes there at all, probably the first charge against him is only a few years, but that's probably just the first of many. In my own case, my first indictment was for 3 counts, felony counts. That was later expanded to 12 felony counts by the end of the year for a possible 115-year sentence. So I think this is a warning, a shot across the bow of every editor and publisher in the country. If they make the connection of the Real News Network book that he was carrying with him into prison, which I think Gore Vidal would be very pleased to see him associated with this incident in terms of defending Julian Assange's rights. But they may connect you. You may be in the next conspiracy trial with Julian Assange. It may not take much more than that. I see on the indictment, which I've just read, that one of the charges is that he encouraged Chelsea Manning, then Bradley Manning, to give him documents, more documents, after she had already given him hundreds of thousands of files. Well, if that's a crime, then journalism is a crime, because just on countless occasions, I have been asked by journalists for documents or for more documents than I had yet given them. So none of them have been put on trial up till now. But in this case, if that's all it takes, then no journalist is safe. The freedom of the press is not safe. It's over. And I think our republic is in its last days, because unauthorized disclosures of this kind are the life's blood of a republic.
Now, it is very interesting that President Moreno of Ecuador withdrew the asylum that was protecting Julian Assange until today in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, which led to all of this. And Jen Robinson, who's Julian Assange, one of his lawyers, tweeted as he was being arrested that she wanted to confirm that Assange had been arrested not just for breach of bail conditions, but also in relation to the U.S. Extradition request. Now, in your assessment of having undergone this kind of allegations and arrests and being under this kind of scrutiny by the state? What do you think the real intentions here is of the United States in forcing this revocation of his asylum from the Ecuadorian embassy, as well as this request for extradition?
You know, I think the word forcing may be misleading here because it underrates the degree of choice here that Ecuador and the British had in both these cases, and for that matter, the Department of Justice. But they couldn't really force Ecuador to break the norm of international asylum here by handing him over. They couldn't force Britain. Obviously, both of those were induced by various incentives. My guess would be in the case of Moreno that he's involved in debt relief, and the U.S., the great creditor nation here, although it's actually a debtor nation in altogether, but they're enabled to bring the kind of pressure on Ecuador that caused essentially a lawless action here, which threatens everyone in asylum, everyone in the world, in the people in this country who have been granted political asylum, people in Britain, and certainly in Ecuador. So that's very ominous. The British have had a long history here of servility, basically, with respect to their ally, the United States, and again are not too concerned, I think, about law. So why exactly this moment is chosen for Ecuador and Britain to truckle to the United States, I'm not sure. I noticed that the indictment was signed a year ago in March 2018. Maybe the price has been haggling between Ecuador and Britain as to what the price would be for handing him over. As I say, though, it's a threat not only to journalists, but to people in political status, in political asylum everywhere. But the immediate threat, if you say the significance of this for Trump, I have no doubt that he wants to define criminally in a courtroom the press as an enemy of the people. When I say that Assange seeking documents, something that I've been asked countless times by a journalist to do, to give them documents, if that's all it takes, then the First Amendment means very little. And without freedom of the press, you have very little freedom in the country. I'm afraid that's the direction we're going. So journalists in general, I think, should rally around this case, whatever they think of Julian himself. There's a lot of people who don't like Julian personally. I am not one of those. I do like him. There's a lot of people who are very critical of his actions in the election in 2016 on various grounds. I'm not happy with the result to the extent that it in any way aided President Trump to become president. And Trump did, of course, plight his love for Julian at one point. He said, "I love WikiLeaks," when it seemed to be helping him in the, but of course, a promise of love from Donald Trump is not terribly reliable. We knew that already. So he's willing to make him the sacrificial goat here, I think, for journalists in general.
Donald Trump repeatedly extolled the leaker of the Democrats' secrets and reveled in the damage he believed WikiLeaks would do to Hillary Clinton's campaign.
This WikiLeaks is like a treasure trove.
It's a different story now that Julian Assange is under arrest and facing a criminal conspiracy charge for the theft of official U.S. secrets.
Do you still love WikiLeaks?
I know nothing about WikiLeaks. It's not my thing. I know nothing really about them. I don't really have any.
Manning, who gave Julian the material, has served 7.5 years in prison and is in prison again right now, apparently because they want her to go beyond what she said, either falsely, which they would be happy with, to incriminate Julian Assange. After all, torture is mainly used for false confessions to get them, and it's usually successful at that, but not successful with Chelsea Manning. She was in solitary confinement for 10.5 months until public pressure got her released into the general prison population years ago. And clearly she's not being a person who can be tortured into a false confession. or they would want her to give new details of her dealings with Assange that would help them in their prosecution of Assange. And she is not cooperating with the grand jury on that, which she objects to the grand jury as an undemocratic, unconstitutional really, but undemocratic process in its secrecy, its lack of legal defense, legal support in that process. And many people over the years have resisted that. As a matter of fact, my co-defendant, Tony Russo, refused to testify to the grand jury after I was indicted, but before the new indictment. And he spent about a month in jail before he himself was indicted and added to the indictment. So that's a precedent for what Chelsea Manning is doing now. He didn't want to be testifying against me in secret to a grand jury, no transcript of the proceedings, no publicity as to what he may have been said. In fact, he offered to testify if he was given a transcript that he could publish of his testimony, and they refused to do that and indicted him himself. I say again, that was Anthony Russo, who's no longer alive. But Chelsea is doing that right now. She's acting very courageously. Again, induced the British to arrest him forcibly, as just happened, indicates that they will go the extra mile in violating, as I say, international norms by violating his immunity and his asylum and then shipping off to the U.S. In my day, his case would have been almost sure to be upheld by this, that is, the case dismissed by the Supreme Court on grounds of violating the First Amendment. But that was a different Supreme Court 40 years ago. And this court, I don't think at all he could count on to defend the Supreme Court or much else in the Bill of Rights. I think a great deal is at risk nowadays, especially with the last couple of appointments that Trump has made. So, but before that as well. So it's a very ominous situation, not only for Julian Assange, who's been in one room for almost 7 years now. Something I suspect, by the way, has affected his judgment in some respects. I don't endorse every choice he's made, or in the last couple of years in particular. I don't know what kind of judgment I'd be showing after 6 years in one room. I think he has ahead of him for having taken on the world's mightiest empire and exposed its criminal secrets in many cases, having to do with torture and assassination. He's not going to get any breaks from them. I think he'll be in one room, possibly in solitary confinement, on the excuse that he has further secrets that he might reveal, just as Ed Snowden would face that, I think, possibly for the rest of his life. And that will certainly be far, far more onerous than the room he's had in the Ecuadorian embassy, which already was amounted to inhumane treatment. Journalists in general, especially, and everybody who values a free press, and not only in this country, to join ranks here now to expose and resist the wrongful and, in this country, unconstitutional abuse of our laws to silence journalists. I wouldn't be at all surprised if he is further indicted under the Espionage Act, as I was the first person to do that. I suspect that'll be added to his charges. And again, that's a great danger to journalists general. They have to inform themselves on it and begin to demand that the Espionage Act not be used against the free press as